But we've managed to cram quite a lot in. If you could whiz on a couple of slides there, Danny, or just one slide. So we've covered like quite a broad range of books that we were discussing at the start. Danny, a few months ago, read You Have the Right to Remain Fat, which I find phenomenally interesting, and we've had lots of other business books. I think most importantly, we've had sort of lovely speakers as well. I've compiled all the faces of the folks that have spoken at 5Things already. And Danae there has kindly done, I think, 3 stints. so thanks to Danae for her support. And I am delighted to add another 3 faces to that list of illustrious speakers. Today we've got Vonny LeClerc, we've got Emily Horgan and Nathan Fulwood. So let's not muck about and get straight to the good stuff. And first up is Vonny. So I've attempted to cobble together a bio from what I know about you, Vonny, so excuse me if I'm horrendously incorrect here, but Vonny's a journalist, a content strategist, a BBC Scotland alumna. She's also a mother, a musician, a snake owner, and from what I can tell, an expert kitten rearer. Is that fair to say?
I don't know if I'm an expert, but certainly kitten rearer, they're everywhere just now.
So Vonny's going to tell us what she's learned from Trick Mirror. Vonny.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Today I'm going to talk about Trick Mirror. This is an essay collection by the cultural critic Gia Tolentino. She's been called the voice of a generation, and after reading this, I've got to agree. It was written during a cultural inflection point, the WTF moment of Trump winning the presidency. And I actually read this during another inflection point, or collective WTF, as the pandemic hit and lockdown started. I was actually quite sick with COVID when I read it, so which was kind of the best and worst time to read it. You'll love this book if you both love and hate the internet. If you like essayists like Rebecca Solnit and Susan Sontag, and if you're still trying to get your head around what's going on in 2020. So at first glance, this looks like it's a book about sex, drugs, and the internet. It's not. It's about how each of these things, these sort of defining unofficial pillars of millennial culture, of internet culture, are features of our time in history and are actually not as superficial as they seem. Things that we might consider shallow, superficial, morally corrupt, like reality TV or the rise of the influencer, they actually provide a really useful way of looking at and thinking about the world that we live in. Like a trick mirror at a fun fair, each of these things reflects a distorted picture of the truth. We're so distracted that we miss an opportunity to use these things to examine the social, economic, and political climate in detail. So if you're willing to take the time to look beyond the surface, there are deeper truths to be discovered here, and even in the most infuriating and facile aspects of our culture. It's a book that will make you question everything that you think you know and demand that you kind of burn your beliefs to the ground. So the first thing that this book taught me was that the internet industrial complex is very real. The internet is so enmeshed in our lives that we often critically examine, we often don't take the time to critically examine what it's doing to us. We're dependent on it and we benefit from it in many ways, but because it provides us with so much, we often overlook the more insidious aspects of living such highly networked and connected, always on lives. You know, we have to be online now, but that means that we've agreed to always be on to maintain digital versions of ourselves to access the things that we need to get through our lives. Shopping, news, jobs, connections, social relations, yet it's actually nothing like real life. And because society is now structured around it, we've got no choice but to participate or lose out. So we've signed up to something without really understanding what we're giving in return. So by being online, we're also making people very, very rich. We, our digital selves, have become a commodity. We're the means of production. Our likes, our dislikes, our habits and peccadillos, our relationships, our data. So this essay asks us to consider what we're getting out of this connected life. Is it worth the price of admission? The internet is actually built around lots of things that are detrimental to us in many ways. It inflates our sense of self. It causes us to distort ourselves online and maintain that distortion. It makes us think about our opinions and that we value them more than anyone else's. It makes us feel really important. It pits us against one another. It flattens complex issues into binaries. It polarizes people by default because conflict is the driving force behind getting likes and clicks and shares. It makes us feel like we're doing enough to show up for one another because solidarity is measured in clicks and performative posts. So we don't have to fully engage with subjects or empathize with others. Instead, we kind of insert ourselves into other people's struggles through our own posts and delude ourselves that we can relate and that we're actually doing enough to affect change. And the other thing that the internet does for us is that it distorts the scale of what truly matters in the world. The most important stories don't get the most views or the most traction online. Algorithms show people only what they're interested in seeing first. For example, an Instagram celebrity revelation will get far more views, far more coverage than, an ongoing famine in Yemen. And when you actually stop to think about that stuff, it's horrific. So I'll read you a quote from this essay. Gia Tolentino says that capitalism has no land left to cultivate but the self. Everything's being cannibalized, not just goods and labor, but personality and relationships and attention. I think, next slide. Okay, here we go. So the next lesson that Gia Tolentino teaches us in this book are that beauty ideals are just as toxic as they ever were. Back in 1990, Naomi Wolf wrote The Beauty Myth, examining the prison of beauty ideals that women are trapped inside in a culture that is basically structured around both capitalism and patriarchy. The premise being that as women grew more financially independent from men, a new locus of control emerged, and that was the beauty industry. As feminism has become more mainstream, we've kind of deluded ourselves into thinking that we've shaken off these trappings. We see greater diversity now compared to that baseline, though it's nowhere near a true reflection of reality. We've got a body positivity movement. We're prioritizing and empowering women, and that's become a mantra for kind of mainstream liberal feminism, the idea of choice and the illusion of choice. The truth is that, while it seems that we've made some progress, we're actually just talking about beauty in a different way, in a way that actually hides what's going on. We live in the age of an optimized self. So instead of doing beauty work, as Naomi Wolf called it, we practice self-care. Instead of diets, we go on cleanses and do clean eating. It's a reframing, not a liberation. So it's now not enough to sort of like overline your lips. You've got to have fillers. It's not enough to wear Spanx. You've got to adopt the relentless fitness regime so that you look like that all the time, so that you become your online self offline. Today, more than ever, women are encouraged to not only look a certain way, but to become the living embodiment of that ideal. How a woman looks can become her personal brand. And because it's a personal brand and a way of making money, it's become even more pernicious than it ever was. So as she says in this essay, we've got something much deeper burrowing now, not only a beauty myth, but a lifestyle myth, a paradigm where women can muster all the technology, all the money and politics available to her to actually become the idealized self. So the next essay is about how religious devotion is kind of like getting high. For some people, religious participation and drug taking might seem like opposite ends of a moral spectrum, where we're encouraged to think of it that way, with religion being the embodiment of purity and moral clarity, and drug taking being the embodiment of impurity and moral deviation. For anyone who's grown up with a religious background and has at some point segued into recreational drug taking, there are more than a few parallels here right for examination. Gia Tolentino grew up in a religious conservative Christian household, the sort of place where Disney movies were banned and she couldn't have a peace sign on her jotter, that sort of thing. She grew up attending a megachurch that she affectionately nicknamed the Repentagon, which I kind of love. When she was in high school, she started to have her doubts about religion, and by the time she was in college, as many people do, she experimented with drugs. And when she took ecstasy for the first time, she had this sort of revelation. It was at this point in her life that she realized that drugs, like religion, offered her an opportunity to transcend herself, that a spiritual high by an alternate means. Both religious ecstasy and chemical ecstasy allows her to experience something bigger than herself and to examine the world from a different perspective. So she complicates the idea of both religious participation and drug taking. Religious participation does have something beautiful and positive to offer, even to skeptics, but drug taking also offers something that makes everything feel like it was divinely intended and that they're not so different after all. Quote from this essay that I'd like to share is that she says that taking drugs can feel like divinity. It can make you feel healed and religious. It can make you feel dangerously wild. So what's the difference really? The next essay is one called The Story of a Generation in 7 Scams, where we're introduced to the unsettling notion that scams are not only everywhere, they're not only ubiquitous, but they're actually kind of laundering their reputation now. Scams are not just the preserve of con men, people knowingly engage in them as a means of accessing unprecedented wealth and power. Scams have become kind of so obvious and widespread that we barely react to them anymore. We know that Facebook's cashing in on our data. We know that Jeff Bezos has an obscene amount of money from his shopping monopoly. We know that the financial crisis was caused by handing out shonky loans to people that the banks knew couldn't afford them. And yet we still all use social media. We all still shop on Amazon. We all still rely on the banks. Donald Trump has ascended to the presidency not only by believing his own BS, but by duping the masses into believing it too, even when there's every conceivable bit of evidence to the contrary of what comes out of his mouth. The truth is that scamming pays today. People who try and rinse everything they can out of others are often rewarded with enormous wealth and unprecedented power. So not only has it become possible to do this, it's kind of become aspirational for some people, and that's the really scary thing. And she looks at the story of Billy McFarland, the guy behind the now infamous Fire Festival, who has just bounced from one scam to another. And we all know he's doing it, but he's made loads of money in the process. So the quote I'd like to share from this one is that the pipe dream is becoming the dominant structure of aspiration, and its end stage, shadows, cruelty, carelessness, nihilism are closely following behind. And the last lesson, one of many that this book taught me, is that feminist tropes and sort of internet feminism are harming the feminist cause. In the essay, The Cult of the Difficult Woman, she talks about the way that social media and internet feminism harm the global feminist cause. As it's become more mainstream, as feminism has become more mainstream, a deep examination through a feminist lens hasn't similarly become mainstream at the same time. An understanding of what feminism is can kind of be like really quickly gleaned from headlines and social media posts without any real meaningful engagement with the subject. So it's become commonplace now to refract feminist issues through the prism of celebrity, turning celebrities into quote unquote feminist icons merely for existing in a world where the odds are stacked against women generally. The bar for what qualifies as a feminist act now has become not what is radical, but what is simply being labelled as difficult for failing to conform in whatever sense that might be. Any criticism can be framed as sexist at the core if it's levelled against a woman. So any woman who's on the receiving end of it, ergo, becomes a feminist in the eyes of the media. The consequence of this is that the nasty women trope can kind of be control A, control like C, control V'd onto any woman, however undeserving of a feminist label she actually is. So you end up with a situation where Melania Trump gets praised in the New York Times for her quiet radicalism, or Theresa May gets hailed as a feminist icon for being prime minister, even though she backed cuts to social care, benefits, and policies that disproportionately harmed the lives of women. The internet is powered by memes, tropes, and standard content formats. And when we employ these without thinking about the consequences of that action, we dilute serious issues, we flatten them, and it becomes all too easy to label women as feminists just for existing in a sexist society. And because of that, our activism is in danger of becoming shallow and lazy. And so the quote I'll share from this one is that when a case for a woman's worth is built partly on the unfairness of what's levelled at her, things get slippery. So, conclusions. This is a quick and dirty overview of the Whip-Smart essay collection Trick Mirror by Gia Tolentino. It's one of those rare reads that you'll come back to again and again. It's one that in my Kindle app, like I feel like almost every second line is highlighted and that I've referred to again and again. This is a handful. This is 5 takeaways from a book that will just continually make you think. It's brilliant, it's challenging, and perhaps most importantly, it really sort of tries to encourage you not to dismiss things that you would otherwise consider trivial, and that you can use them as a way to examine yourself and examine the world around you more deeply. If you enjoyed this, you can find me on all the usual platforms, including Goodreads. I read a lot of books, and usually on Instagram, I do a story every month kind of recapping what I've read in miniature. I really hope that you do read this book. It's wonderful. It's one that I have bought for many other people and will continue to do so. Thank you so much for listening.
Thanks so much, Vonny. That was awesome. The crowd are going wild for that. That was truly awesome. I totally agree with everything you say. I think I just finished that book. It's such a, as you say, a belief burner, and I could have probably just taken my highlight over the Kindle and just highlighted the whole book. It was so good. So I think you've sold that to lots of folk as well. It'd be great if you've got any questions for Vonny, just to put them in the chat window just now. That'd be really helpful, or save them up and we'll have a chat at the end. So we'll move on swiftly to our next speaker, who is Emily.
Hey.
Hi, Emily. So I'm lucky enough to work with Emily at Free Agent. She's not only a product design superstar, she's also the co-editor and curator of So Hormonal. It's an anthology of narratives on hormones, and you can pick up a copy practically any indie bookshop in Edinburgh, and I'm sure it's got like wider distribution than that. But Emily's going to tell us what she's learned from Revolting Prostitutes. Emily.
Yes, before I start, Vonny, that was so amazing. I loved it. I feel like I want to formally ask you to go for coffee with me because I want to talk to you a lot. So please say yes. But what I'm speaking about today is Revolting Prostitutes, The Fight for Sex Workers' Rights by Juna Mack and Molly Smith. And it's a book about, next slide please, sex workers' rights from an intersectional feminist labour rights perspective. So basically I saw Molly and Juno speak at the Radical Book Festival in Edinburgh maybe like 2 years ago. And I read it back then and I was just so impressed by them. They're so amazing and they spoke so well. But I read it again this year because it seems like sex work and sex workers' rights has kind of come up in the media this year with things like OnlyFans making kind of versions of sex work a lot more accessible to folks. So it feels quite relevant, and hopefully the takeaways from the book that I'll be sharing today will give you maybe a better understanding or an alternative understanding to sex work and rights. So the first takeaway is sex work is work. So this is the foundation to the entire book. So when we stopped focusing on the sex part of work, when we focus more on the work part of sex work, we begin to think of sex work in the same ways we would think about our own work. So for example, if you work as a contractor or a freelancer, which I'm sure a lot of people here do, you benefit hugely from asking for advice on your pricing or pricing your services, having nice meetups like this and groups of support, having public platforms where you can advertise your services and pre-vet your clients, having shared workspaces like a hot desking area. But many countries have restrictive laws that mean these benefits that we kind of take for granted are not necessarily offered to sex workers. In the US, for example, many websites where sex workers can communicate their services and pre-vet clients are taken down. In the UK, if you just pop to the next slide, we have a partial criminalization model where, thank you so much. Back one, yeah. Where some aspects of the industry, often the most visible, such as street-based sex work, are criminalised. Within England, Scotland and Wales, the acts of buying and selling sex are legal, but almost everything else is criminalised. So for example, soliciting, or quote, curb crawling is what they call it, working indoors with friends, or facilitating sex work. So this is all illegal. So this means that meeting clients in a safe space, for example, is not possible. And by a safe space, I mean like outdoors, like soliciting work outdoors. Working with friends is not possible. So if you have more than one sex worker living in a house, or someone who facilitates sex work to kind of keep them safe, that's illegal because it's considered a brothel. So I guess if this was the case for us as workers, and we're not as vulnerable as sex workers, if we couldn't do the things that we really benefit from, like we wouldn't feel that great about it, and it would negatively impact us. So I guess it's worth considering that this happens for a lot of sex workers. So the next takeaway is think twice before calling the police. So the police system does not benefit sex workers is kind of one of the points that the book argues. The power the police have over vulnerable folks can be devastating, particularly for trans, Black and migrant sex workers. And I guess if this year has taught us anything, it's that the police do not always have the best interest at heart for many in the society. And while this is not a call to walk away when you think a sex worker or anyone for that matter is in danger, it's a call to be more cognizant of what the outcome for that person might be. So the book outlines many examples of women and sex workers being arrested, quote, for their own good, under the assumption that women would have a better, safer life locked up. Given the way the prison system works and the fact that folks in the sex industry are likely already in difficult situations with things like drugs, poverty, childcare, this is not exactly a great alternative. Often the workers end up deported, have their money taken from them, or have their families taken from them. And with the video footage that we've all been exposed to of late, and that many people have experienced for decades, it's very clear that alternative services might be better placed in helping people. So for example, Swarm, so that's SWARM, or Umbrella Lane in Glasgow, both offer support services and outreach programs. And it might be worth considering if you find yourself or someone in a situation where they're in sex work and might be in danger. So the third takeaway is your feminism is not intersectional enough. So the book makes it very clear that their position is not that the sex industry is valuable or desirable in itself. And as feminists, they understand the misogyny and violence that's experienced in the sex trade to be apparent. But to humanely abolish sex work, it would mean that marginalized people no longer have to sustain themselves through the sex industry. So it would no longer be necessary for survival. So as a feminist, you can't just focus on those two aspects of the industry, the misogyny and the violence. You must be more intersectional. You must care about winning rights for freedom of movement, labor rights, access to services and to work without the threat of deportation, employment alternatives, better welfare provisions, cheaper housing, support services for single mothers, all of which make sex work unnecessary. And the book argues that if all of these resources were provided, then nobody would really need to sell sex, which is why I'm a massive fan of universal basic income, but I feel like that's a whole other talk. So many books I could talk about on that one. Maybe I'll make a comeback tour. So yeah. The fourth takeaway is that the Nordic model is not the perfect solution. So many people might have heard about the Nordic model and maybe aren't too sure what it is or feel like it's a great solution, but maybe don't know the ins and outs. So if you just pop to the next slide, I've put a definition there for you. So the Nordic model, defined by this book, is a legal regime that criminalizes the purchase of sex and punishes third parties such as managers, drivers, and landlords, while ostensibly decriminalizing those who sell sex. So some might think that criminalizing one side of that buy-sell dynamic would increase power to the side of the sellers, so the sex worker, because they're no longer seen as illegal, their work isn't illegal. However, this is not the case for sex workers, as it bases the idea on a perfect supply and demand model. When you reduce demand through criminalization, you expect the supply to eventually reduce, but the supply side is sex workers who need to sell sex for money, and it's their only form of income. It essentially turns it into a buyer's market, which shrinks the market to the point where pricing is essentially a race to the bottom. So the Nordic model doesn't make the seller safer, it just makes the seller more likely to do dangerous things to make their client at ease and to make money. And the safe clients no longer, well, what would be considered safe before if it was legal, they no longer purchase because they're kind of scared of being arrested. So the clientele are kind of riskier. And for those forced to the streets, life has become a lot harder. So the law on purchase of sex has made working as a prostitute harder and more dangerous. And I guess we understand that, right? Like imagine if your job criminalized your clients, you'd be more likely to accept work that paid less on riskier terms just to make ends meet. Or alternatively, you'd move industry, but I guess that's quite a privileged thing to say. There's a general consensus that many folks who go into the sex industry do it because there are little to no other options for them. So what do they expect those workers to do? Now, the Nordic model does offer a, quote, exit scheme, but the book argues that there's little funding in the scheme and that it doesn't really offer a good enough alternative. It doesn't consider a better alternative for sex workers and prostitutes to leave. And so they're left in a dangerous situation, essentially. So the last takeaway is kind of their proposal of what is a good kind of way to manage sex work. And that's decriminalize, not legalize. So there's a difference between decriminalizing and legalizing, which a lot of people kind of confuse when they speak about prostitution. So if you want to pop to the next slide of kind of, this is from the authors. So legalization would mean the regulation of prostitution with laws regarding where, when, and how prostitution could take place. Whereas decriminalization eliminates all laws and prohibits the state and law enforcement officials from intervening in any prostitution-related activities or transactions unless other laws apply. So essentially, legalization is defined as legalizing some sex work in some contexts when it's rolled out. And often it means heavily controlling what folks can and can't do. They're considered to be regulatory models, so models that legalize certain aspects of sex work, and it's what we think of when we think of the Netherlands and Amsterdam. I suppose everyone sees Amsterdam as kind of maybe like a shining light for sex work, but they have a legal model or a regulatory model. This selective mindset is quite damaging for sex workers. So for example, in Turkey, they have a regulatory model and trans workers are not allowed to be prostitutes. Regulationism, so that's like a kind of term that they use interchangeably with legalization, encourages illegal behavior. So most countries, this is so interesting, most countries that have legalized aspects of sex work have more illegal, unregulated sex trade than the legal side of the sex industry in the same country. And legalization generally profits other folks than the sex workers themselves. So for example, it's generally only legal to work for someone else, like a brothel or a manager, but not alone as a freelancer. Decriminalization is a situation where sex work is legal as the default. So it sees sex workers more as workers, and it brings the work to a level where labor laws can come into play. So essentially it just evens out the playing field. It means that we're all just laborers and workers fighting for better rights. And what falls out of the perspective of decriminalization is a system where the knowledge, safety, and rights of people who sell sex are prioritized. And in order to do this, the regulations placed on the sex industry are shaped by the sex workers themselves. So New Zealand, for example, have this in place right now. And while the book is still critical of New Zealand's model, the imperfections are broader than the sex industry. So they speak about border control and treatment of migrants, welfare support. So like these are things that impact all of us as workers and not just punitively sex workers. And that's it. So as a quick wrap up, so sex work is work. Think twice before calling the police. Your feminism is not intersectional enough. The Nordic model is not the perfect solution. And decriminalize, not legalize. And just as a quick point, like the two authors who wrote this, Juno Mack and Molly Smith, they both work in the sex industry. I don't work in the sex industry, so I'm not speaking on behalf of like a ton of people. I'm just saying what I learned from the book. It was super fascinating, but I really recommend reading it because I always feel uncomfortable maybe speaking on behalf of other people in that kind of way. But yeah, and those two organizations that I mentioned are super helpful and UK based. Both Juno and Molly are UK based sex workers as well. So this is kind of coming from that lens. So yeah, that's me.
Oh, it's thanks so much, Emily. That was like extraordinarily interesting. I think that's what I love about books generally in this event as well, is that it gives me a sliver of insight into a world that I really don't know much about. So I'm definitely going to pick that book up. We'll move on to our last speaker of the day, who is Nathan Fulwood. And I've been lucky enough to work with Nathan a couple of times in a professional capacity. He is the founder and director of, I was going to say new agency on the block, Create Future, but you've been around for ages now, haven't you?
4 years and a bit.
Years. Okay, sort of toddler. Sort of. That's really horrible. Yeah, Nathan's going to get angry about design by telling us about his key takeaways from Ruined by Design by Mike Monteiro.
We'll try and keep it civil. Thanks, Andy, and thanks, Emily and Vonny. It's amazing, right? Fascinating talks. I'd rather just skip mine and just chat about yours. But yeah, I'm going to talk about Ruined by Design, which was the last book I read before lockdown, when this was scheduled before. So I was delighted to see it back. Danae, can you skip on? So as the subtitle to the book says, you know, this is a book about like how designers ruin the world and what we can do to fix it. And it's very much about, you know, the scams and industrial complex that we're in, that Vonny was talking about in her first talk there. So what she did, this is a book by Mike Montero. He runs a design studio in California called Mule. So far what you've got is it's a book by a designer for designers about design. So this question was going to work better in person, but like, who here, you know, considers themselves a designer? See a few hands going up. So probably quite a lot that haven't. So, but this book really is like, who is here as a product manager or a product owner, or has any, if you have any influence whatsoever really in the final shape or form or content of the product, you know, or the way that a service works, then you should consider yourself a designer, and this book is for you. And it's very much about trying to leave the world that we created in a better place than we found it. And, you know, I think that's kind of sorely needed right now. So I'll get into it. First slide. So, excuse the language in this. I'm just passing on Mike. He's quite an angry character, and there's quite a lot of profanity in it. I'll kind of keep it clean. So my personal story is I joined the web in 1992, like a lifetime ago, and I've loved it ever since I got my first email address in the States. I love the transformational opportunities it presents. I love the way that anybody, anywhere who wants to comment, to create, or connect with anybody else can. I am just about remain an optimist, if not a utopian. And I'm trying to kind of keep the faith in this amazing invention that we're all lucky enough to live through. But frankly, you know, as Vonny was saying, you know, we're fucking it up. Like, it's turning into, like, you know, scams and an industrial complex. So you look at platforms like Twitter, you know, a platform that I still love for all of those above reasons, you know, has become a mouthpiece for a crazed racist president. You've got Facebook, who are literally messing with people's heads. You may not be aware, and not accidentally either. You know, in 2014, they conducted a psychological experiment which manipulated of 689,003 users with increased positive or negative posts to see if this affected the mood of their future status updates. And they did this without any ethical oversight or anyone's consent. So Facebook's motto of moving fast and breaking things is a terrible motto when you have 2.6 billion users, and when breaking things means intentionally making people feel like shit to see if you can sell them more further down the line. So this book, frankly, is a litany of like how the internet has been broken, how Airbnb is leading to the gutting of affordable housing for residents, how Instagram is linked in study after study to increase mental health issues and to increase in suicide rates among teens, and how it's complicit in things like the way that we hound celebrities such as Caroline Flack earlier this year, literally to death. And let's bring this right up to date. If you go to the next slide, and apologies, a bit of a content trigger warning here. This was shared with me earlier this week. If you can't make it out, I don't even want to go into it. It's foul, to be honest. You know, the text on the right is basically saying that this doesn't contravene Facebook's community standards. So like, how is this acceptable? Hundreds, if not thousands, of designers and developers and moderators are involved in designing, launching, and maintaining the platform that allows for content like this, you know, on Facebook. And as an aside, if you ever go into Twitter and change your language settings or your content settings to Germany, all the Nazis disappear, because Germany has very, very strict laws against hate speech and Nazi propaganda. So and the software will immediately remove all of that content. You know, it doesn't go through moderation, it just gets removed. So it can be done. It's not a software problem. Twitter and Facebook are working exactly as they were designed. So how is this the case? So we go to the next slide. Money is to blame. I know this sounds naive, but look at something like Trump tweeting about nuking North Korea. You know, does it get him banned? Absolutely not. It goes into a highlights email because it drives engagement. So many platforms start with noble aims, apart from Facebook, which was always kind of a little bit pervy, to be honest. But you take Uber. I mean, I'm sure a lot of us kind of fans and, you know, and love the service model of Uber. You know, it's a great multimodal model. It's genius, actually, like, you know, from a business canvas kind of point of view, you know, connecting drivers and passengers, everybody benefits until there's a significant investment event. When that happens, you need to scale. You need to scale to satisfy investors. So all of a sudden you need to hire 5,000 drivers. So background checks get skipped. You know, you need to hire 3,000 developers, and not all of those are top notch, and not all of those are educated in designing ethically. surge pricing comes into effect because you need to make more from every passenger to satisfy those investors. And surge pricing comes into effect even in the aftermath of things like terrorist attacks, as we've seen. You need to expand into 500 cities. So then negotiations with the ecosystems that you're going into and the licensing and the regulators, that has to get kind of shortened and shortcut in a lot of cases. In fact, those negotiations then get dirty because you need to expand so fast. Uber actually created a tool called Greyball, which tracked the numbers and the locations of accounts linked to licensees and council members and so on. So they could see where they were moving at any one time and actually deny them access to any Uber cars, which was illegal and obviously kind of unethical. So it's not just Uber. You know, as we said, Airbnb's gone from a community, a great community. I was a very early adopter of Airbnb, where you would go and stay in other people's homes, connecting holidaymakers and homeowners. You know, and it's gone to something that's gutting neighborhoods. And on occasion, lots of occasions, report occasions, allowing people to deny guests on the basis of their race or their sexuality. So specifically money, particularly VC money, you know, has shifted the delicate balance of these ecosystems. So the need to scale and to demonstrate revenue, you know, shifted the benefactors from the community to the investor. And then that becomes the primary driver for design decisions. So next slide, please. We need to remember who we as designers kind of work for. So there's a long-held, almost kind of like sacrosanct belief in tech that, you know, the way to success is to build a tool that you want to use, like to eat your own dog food, because if you're the customer, then you don't need to guess what anybody else needs. You build something that's going to satisfy you, and then you find other people who are going to want it and use it, and that's the way to success. But the problem with that is that most tech has been built by rooms full of white guys. So product teams in Silicon Valley, just as one example, you know, are dominated by white males. Only 25% of computing jobs are held by women. Only 1% are held by Latinx women. So the biases are built into these platforms from the core, and then they scale. So again, I'm going to wail on Twitter here, but like Twitter never built in a way to deal with harassment because none of the people building it had ever been harassed. So they'd never received death threats. You know, they'd never been stalked. You know, no execs at Facebook were worried about being outed by a real names policy, you know, like dozens of gay teens and trans people were. So I know, you know, we're actually in a really dynamic, really successful sector here in Scotland, but we need to be ready for any tool that we build to have a global impact. Even if it doesn't go global, it's going to reach people that are unlike us when we design it, you know? So people with different needs, different abilities, different cultures, different languages. So, and we should want, and I know so many good designers that do think this way, you know, we want our product to work well for them, not just altruistically, but so that we can take their money and make them customers. So as designers, you know, there's a lot in this book about, you know, the need for us to protect the need of our customers and to stand up to our bosses and to stand up to investors as well in terms of championing those needs. So to do that, we need to better understand them. So what's the answer to better understanding? You know, is it greater empathy? Well, Mike quite gracefully says, fuck no. You know, empathy is great. And I've seen this myself and I've felt this myself. Empathy is great, but too often it's projecting our own experiences and assumptions onto a cohort or persona. Like however much research you do, you still filter it through your own lens of experience. So if we go to the next slide, please. So I'm fully aware that this will be the slide that gets screenshotted with my face over it, and I'm completely prepared for that and comfortable with it. So the answer is not more empathy. The answer is more diverse hiring in our industry. So why teach someone to think outside the box when you can hire outside it? Don't ask a team of male designers to go into the field to see what women think. Hire women to design your products. So this book hammered home that we at Create Future, we need to be more diverse. And Black Book Thinking and Rebel Ideas and a bunch of other books as well that I've read recently, you know. So we need to be more diverse, you know, by gender, socioeconomically, by racially, to deliver better outcomes. You know, we're only a small team, there's 12 of us, so we can't hire for a project. Where we can't hire for a project, you know, we can certainly bring people into the design process, as well participants and users much closer into the design process. Because as much as an ally that I would like to think myself, and however much I educate myself, like this industry, I hadn't realized quite much until reading this, how much this industry, the society is designed around me as a white, able male. So I am a beneficiary of it. And so you need to, you know, and I know it sounds trite, but, you know, being educated to like constantly check your privileges is something that we need to make sure we do as designers. So I'm skipping loads of the book, you know, there's a load more that kind of goes into, but the last point, his last point I thought was quite interesting and controversial was that design should be licensed. So this sounds kind of, as I said, this sounded completely counterintuitive to me when I first saw it and impractical. But the argument is that we as designers wield power over tools that are affecting increasingly large parts of society and increasingly more lives. And that with that power comes responsibility, and we should commit to act responsibly in the same way that we, you know, commit to drive well by agreeing to be licensed. And if this sounds ridiculous, it brings the analogy of meatpacking in the early 20th century in the US, which was documented in a book called The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. So the meatpacking industry, and there's a pretty heavy metaphor here, the meatpacking industry in the US was so foul, so unethical, so vile that they were willing to package and sell diseased meat to the public without them knowing it. And the book was a bestseller. The public got skittish about eating meat. The industry was investigated, and the Meat Inspection Act of 1906 was put in place to protect the public. So I kicked off by listing some of the rotten meat being packaged by the big tech companies. Vonny's covered a couple of them as well in her talk, so I'll not go back there. I mean, I didn't even get into electoral manipulation or Volkswagen faking engine emissions. And if you think this is a US problem, you know, and it can't happen here, you should look into, I was reading recently about the shitty IT rollout of a Horizon system by the post office, which was so badly designed and resulted in honest people being accused and prosecuted of fraud to the extent where one postmaster took his own life. So when people start dying, we regulate industries and we license practitioners. So we need to improve the practices and the standards ourselves, you know, all through the industry bodies that we're part of, or improvements, you know, will be imposed and standards will be imposed upon us. So finally, you know, this isn't a business book, you know, with 5 easy things to kind of put in. You know, it's an angry diatribe and a bit of a kind of call to arms. You know, there are no easy answers in the book. There is, though, a really interesting introduction with an ethics of design manifesto, a kind of Hippocratic oath that has been drafted in concert with a lot of designers, which is well worth reading. So the tech industry as we design it isn't working. It's shifted too far from the societal good, and we as designers, you know, should be comfortable and confident to stand up for ourselves and our users. To design better, we need to understand better and be more diverse. And if we're serious about our craft, then we should be happy to be accountable for it. So Victorian asylums had a simple test to see if a patient was fit to leave an institution. So they'd leave the patient in a room with a sink overflowing and blocked, and a mop and a bucket. And then they'd leave the room and lock the door. And if the patient picked up the mop and the bucket and started frantically mopping the floor, then they weren't allowed to leave. But if they reached in and unblocked the sink and turned off the taps, then they were free to go. So, you know, the mess that we're in kind of may sometimes feel overwhelming, but this book kind of convinced me that it's never too late to, you know, to stop mopping the floor and try and turn off the taps. That's me. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a true round of applause. Thanks so much, Nathan. I know it's a lot to cram in for all 3 of you into such a short presentation. So yeah, I'm gonna choose there must be there's a big round of applause for all 3 speakers. That was like phenomenally interesting. I kind of just wish we could hang all day and talk about these things. I'm not busy. But yeah, we've got unfortunately just 9 minutes left just to chat about these books. So should probably open up to any questions that we have. I don't know, Danae, if there's any questions that have come through on the chat, or we could just all mute and have a chat anyway.
I can actually see the chat right now. Oh, here we go. God, there's like so many messages in the chat.
Some really cool links in there as well. It's really worth I might try and grab that and share it with you all, because there's some really interesting links that you can follow up with afterwards. I was phenomenally interested. I've got so many questions about all of them, but just because it's top of mind, Nathan. I suppose you could argue, you know, the case of Twitter removing content for certain audiences in Germany, and that's like totally possible, obviously. So you could argue that for a UK audience or for any other audience, that friction is intentional, that they want to keep that content. Is that?
Absolutely, because it drives engagement. I mean, that's the argument in the book. Yeah. There's a couple of arguments that are used. There's one that it's just technically too difficult, which is nonsense, because it's been shown that, that it can be done. And the other is that, these things need to be platforms for free speech. Well, and like free speech means that you can say whatever you want. It doesn't mean that you have to be given a space to say it. It doesn't mean like that, a platform has to give you the right to do it. You can kick anybody off for saying stuff that's just grossly offensive. As I say, the platforms are doing exactly as they're designed. They're driving huge amounts of engagement, and it's making a lot of people a lot of money, as Vonny was saying, and it's making it into a more divisive. It's doing the opposite of what the web was designed for. This kind of utopian dream that by sharing more knowledge and connecting people, that it would bring us kind of together and give us greater understanding. But intentionally, it's being used to drive rifts. Even this week, there's a story in the news about an employee at Facebook whistleblowing and saying, it's known in there the amount of kind of scams and lies being perpetrated by governments to their own people to kind of get policies through in governments around the world, let alone foreign interference in other governments' kind of elections. So this is not something that, we've built it and this is on the responsibility of the people using it. There's nothing we can do about it. It's complicit with the people who own these platforms. They know it's happening and they enable it.
There's a couple of questions here. So Danny had a question for Emily. I don't actually know if it's a question, Danny, or I'll just read it out because I think it's really interesting that the feminist perspective is focused on providing the freedoms and getting the support in place, which would mean that sex work isn't necessary. I hadn't realized that. I thought it was more focused on choice. Is there anything you want to add on that, Emily?
Yeah, like they do speak about about kind of the idea of choice and stuff like that, and I guess like their perspective, like they're very like Marxist in their views, and they believe that all work is exploitative. So like I guess from that perspective, they just see it beyond the sex work part, that it's like any labor is inherently exploitative and you don't necessarily get to choose in a capitalist society to work or not. So they kind of bring it beyond just the sex work part. I think it's definitely worth reading because they do speak about like choice feminism and lots of different strands of feminism and how each of them can be quite detrimental, like to sex workers. I think ultimately the main thing is they don't speak for all sex workers, I suppose. Like there's a lot of people who might want to be in that industry, but they said like from their own experiences, often it's not necessarily a choice. It's more of a kind of a needs must kind of thing. And it like any of us, we all work because we have to, So like it's again removing the stigma of the sex part and just seeing it for what it is, which is a form of work that maybe isn't the most desirable. But yeah, I would definitely recommend reading it. It feels quite strange because I know the like format of this talk is that we're representing the takeaways from a book, but I also feel like a little bit uncomfortable that it might sound like I'm speaking on behalf of sex workers. So I would probably just deflect it to the book, if that's okay.
Yeah. Question for Nathan. You mentioned about diversity in your organization and bringing in contractors depending on requirements. Do you have a D&I strategy, and have you intentionally expanded your freelance or contractor network to support this intention?
Yeah, so we, yes, we have. I mean, obviously we have a diversity inclusion policy and an approach. We've, in the last couple of years, in the last hires, we've gone out and we've made sure that all of our, Jessica Mullen, our MD, is consulted with people to make sure that we've our job postings are written in a way which is as inclusive as possible, because it often starts right there. Even those biases are built into the way that we advertise jobs, about the kind of the benefits and the working conditions and so on that we offer. So we've tried to write them to make sure that there is amenable to people applying from all strata, genders, sexualities, locations as well. And that's been great. It's actually meant we've got think we're at least 50-50 in terms of our kind of gender split. And then in terms of like broadening the pool of people, I'm part of Creative Edinburgh, which I absolutely love, which gives us a kind of like access to kind of really diverse network, and not just the people who are confident enough to maybe come up and reach out to us. We're engaged with a lot of organizations through schools and colleges as well, which gives us access to people who are coming up through the ranks. You know, we do our best. You know, there's a long way to go, and we're always kind of like looking at opportunities like who we can bring into the fold. Truth is, in Scotland, we just have to look at the people in the street. You know, we're a very kind of white society as well, and then our industry is kind of very white, so we are looking at opportunities as well to kind of bring in people from different backgrounds and different races as well. To work with us. So it is intentional. We've got a long way to go, and by no means we're not perfect, and I hold that up. So
there was one more question for you, Nathan. Would it be difficult to follow the design book if you have no background or experience in the design world?
No, absolutely not. As I say, it's not a design technicality thing here. It's really just kind of like opening the eyes about how we can just be. And if anything, even if you're not a designer, I think it's really interesting to read books, you know, like the ones Emily's recommending as well. Like, you know, it's not maybe not an industry you're in, but it gives you a better understanding of it, and you can see what's kind of going on. So whether you're a practitioner or not, I think it's just good to see, you know, these things as systems are being built around you. It's not a technical book whatsoever. It's very accessible. And actually, Mike Montiero is a prolific blogger. So maybe in the first instance, go and find his blog posts and read a few of those. And if they appeal, then get your hands on the book or contact me and I'll send you my copy. I think it's only available by ordering direct from the States. So.
There was one more comment I thought I'd just pull out. So Katie, who asked that question earlier in the chat, said, I've been working in social moderation for a few years now, and it's amazing how little you can do on a lot of these platforms to report or remove the kinds of content we've been talking about. I feel like that that speaks to both Vonny and Nathan's chat. And not to put you on the spot, Katie, but is there anything else in chat or anything like that you'd add to that? I'm super interested in that.
I bet they make it very easy to place adverts and take your money. They make it very hard to highlight the issue of like any problems with the platform, because it's not something that affects them, and actually they benefit from it.
Yeah, and Katie, is there anything you'd add?
I mean, it's just something that we found kind of surprising when we first started getting into social moderation, because the platforms themselves kind of make it look like there's lots you can do. Like they just say, all you need to do is report it. All you need to do is click this button and hide the comment, etc., etc. And then when you're actually doing it for clients, you realize, like, if I hide this comment, I'm only hiding it from the brand owner. You know, everyone else can still see it. Or if I report it, nothing's going to happen. I've never reported anything and seen something come of it. Like, and we do it all the time, every day. So yeah, it's just something I think people aren't aware of, because all the platforms just say, follow our processes and everything will be fine, as if that's actually going to lead anywhere.
Yeah, I think it's such a good thing to point out in the context, especially of this conversation. Andy, I'm conscious of time.
Fortunately, it's 9 o'clock, which is rubbish. We've got so many questions. I had some questions for you, Vonny, but they're huge. And we could probably definitely not answerable within a minute or so. But I'm sure if anyone's got any sort of follow-up questions, the speakers, Emily and Nathan and Vonny, won't mind answering them online. But yeah, unfortunately, we've got to finish up there. I absolutely loved that. It's like phenomenal, 3 phenomenal talks. So thank you so much to Emily, Vonny and Nathan for putting in the effort to give those talks.
And thank you, Andy, for organising.
Sorry? Oh, you're welcome.
Andy, for organising.
So I think, yeah, just like a final round of applause for our 3 speakers. Truly wonderful. Really enjoyed that. I'll share this recording online. Actually, I'll ask the permission of Emily and Nathan and Vonny first. But yeah, I think we'll check out there, and hopefully I will try and do this again next month. 3 new speakers, 3 new books. But I can't be better than that, can it? I think we've peaked. So I'm sure it will be. Anyway, thanks so much, folks, and have a great Wednesday. Bye.
Bye, everybody. Thanks, Andy.
Bye.